Thank you so much, Krista. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone. So Manzoor and I have gone over some questions that we're going to go back and forth on. And then, as Donna said, at about what would be 7:35 my time, 8:35 Eastern time, I guess 6:35 Western time, we will move it over to conversation with the rest of you. So Manzoor, hi, great to see you after just speaking by phone earlier. So could you start us out by just talking about what led you to form Muslims for Social Justice and what your definition of Muslim liberation theology is?
Okay, well, thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you all the friends, JMR and Jewish Recipes and rest of the folks here. Thank you for organizing that webinar. Regarding what led us to found Muslim for Social Justice. The Muslim for Social Justice was founded in 2013, and basically it was founded through some core founding members from Black radical tradition or Black liberation movement, Saladin Muhammad, Shafia Ambalia, with whom I've been working since 2004. They are also key members in Black Focus for Justice and UE Local 150. And the reason was to build a Muslim organization that would be rooted in social justice practice, but also rooted in its understanding and analysis of racism, capitalism, and imperialism. Because Black radical tradition has always connected racism to this broader question of capitalism and imperialism. But also because the history of Islam also is almost a history in the United States, is also part of history of slavery in the United States. Up to 15 to 30% of enslaved human beings who were brought to the United States were Muslim. Of course, their religion and heritage was robbed from them, and they were in many cases converted to Christianity. At the end of slavery, many of them reverted to Islam and established some of the first mosques. So the history of Islam and history of slavery is, deeply intertwined. And also then the politics or the oppression of Islamophobia is also directly a product of anti-Black racism. So without understanding racism, without understanding its connection to the economic system, to imperialism, we feel we cannot even fight against Islamophobia. And a Muslim organization that has that clarity is essential. And regarding your question, what do we mean by Muslim liberation theology? It's basically, we believe that a Muslim liberation theology organization is not just focused on a ritual practice of religion, but more focused in the practice of social justice. There's a saying also in Islam that there are two kinds of responsibilities for Muslims. One is called hukukullah, or responsibilities between humans and God, like how many times are you praying, and many other practices that Muslims are supposed to do. And the other practice is called hukukul ibad, which is responsibility or rights between humans to humans, between people to people. And there's also saying that God can forgive you for the rights that you forget to practice between God and that are owed to God. But He will not, well, I don't know the pronoun, but the God will not forgive any violation of rights to other human beings. So that's our whole emphasis. And as I mentioned earlier, that Islam always had an emphasis on social justice. There's a saying that if you see injustice, you stop it by your hand, or you stop it by your hand, or speak against it, or at least say something against it in your heart. And that third form is the weakest form of your faith. So that emphasis always was there. We feel we need to bring more analysis of racism and capitalism and imperialism in the whole understanding of this practice, which we feel is more advanced than 1400 years ago, based on Islamic texts of many scholars who do say that Islam is against racism. But what exactly is racism? We feel we need to have a deeper analysis and also work under the leadership of the Black radical movement that is fighting against racism.
Interesting. So I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that Islam has always had this strong tradition of standing up for really a radical form of social justice. Because as we know, the Muslim population is a lot more diverse than most people think. It's diverse politically, economically, and ethnically. You highlighted the large number of African-American Muslims in the United States. But there's often, when you hear people talk about, how we stand up against Islamophobia, I'll hear, and I often hear even from Muslim populations, we're a very middle-class population, and we have more patents than any other ethnic group in the United States, and we contribute $5 billion to the American economy. So how do we get this Muslim liberation theology across when there is this economic and political divide even within the Muslim community?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I believe similar discussions take place in terms of civil rights movement or anti-Black racism and all oppressions, that we cannot fight these oppressions with respectability politics. Mm-hmm. And once we have this whole understanding of how the systemic oppression is founded on economic inequality and other forms of oppression, then our liberation cannot be tied to the same oppression, basically, which lead to the middle class less status or upward mobility for few people, but at the same time they're rooted in racism and other forms of oppression. So one of the ways then when we founded Muslim for Social Justice, this was actually also we were acutely aware of this phenomenon of how there is within a large segment of non-Black immigrant Muslims this aspiration for whiteness, this aspiration for upward mobility, and respectability politics, even in the wake of Islamophobia, that all we need to do is to work hard, make more money, have a good resume, and everything will be okay. And we felt that that itself is a form of injustice, because we cannot fight Islamophobia without linking it to the broader struggle against racism. And also, I want also acknowledge the unfortunate reality that there is a huge discrimination and racism within a large segment of non-Black Muslim population, the immigrant Muslim population, that our purpose, one of the mission or the goals of Muslim for Social Justice was to fight racism both within the Muslim population and beyond the Muslim population. And also we had a direct challenge to many Muslim organizations that who have invisibilized African American Muslim population, basically. Their experience, their history, they have invisibilized by the content of the organization, by how they are formed, who's the board members, who make them up. And oftentimes, one of the largest Muslim organizations, when you don't even see a single African American Muslim on their board. So we, even though they espouse anti-racism or Islamophobia, anti-Islamophobia politics, but we say this is often a lip service if you are not even centering the whole organization through the experience of African American Muslims, and also working class Muslims, undocumented Muslims, underemployed, unemployed Muslims, but who are often under the radar screen of large organizations and even in the mosques, because these institutions are often established by wealthy, well-to-do people. So yeah, this is a whole practice that we need to center. If we want to fight Islamophobia or racism, we have to center the experience of the most impacted people. Otherwise, we will not, end that oppression.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about undocumented Muslims. So do you see some intersectional opportunities with perhaps the Latino community? And also, I think that Latino Muslims are one of the largest growing populations within the Muslim community, correct?
Definitely. You're absolutely right. So our whole work, of course, has mostly been based in North Carolina. We have been in touch, I think, with very few number of Latinx Muslim community members, but beyond North Carolina, we have met many amazing organizers, social justice organizers, and we always make that case of Islamophobia too, that it has to connect with the larger struggle of against racism or for immigrant justice, but also in the immigrant rights movement, then also bring the issues of war and imperialism. That how, first of all, we are seeing, for example, the demonizing and dehumanizing of immigrants in the United States, especially in the Trump era. But we also need to basically highlight during that struggle against that bigotry that it is the US foreign policy that create immigrants in the first place. And just like war on terror in the Middle East is creating a lot of immigrant population in Middle East, in Africa, in other parts of the world, but also our policies in Central America, Latin America have also led to increase in immigrants and refugees. So there are many ways we work on the grassroots with Latinx organizations to fight for the rights for the immigrant rights, but also to fight against oppressions, wars, not just wars against Muslim population, but non-Muslim population. But one case I'll give you is Honduras, which is U.S. foreign policy, especially during Obama administration, that they basically supported a coup in Honduras that led to a devastating situation, and many young refugees, came from Honduras, and then they were criminalized. In our own school at Durham, North Carolina, one of them was arrested in a high school. So we always make those connections from local to global struggle with immigrant rights and with other forces that we work with.
And as you mentioned, this started under Obama. It's not just this most recent administration. I wonder if you also have thoughts about the Countering Violent Extremism program and the other forms of maybe liberal government Islamophobia that we're seeing now.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you're right. When we talk about Islamophobia, there's an assumption that this is a domain or province of only racist right-wing forces or GOP or Republican. There's plenty of liberal Islamophobia, politically, culturally, intellectually. Some of the most Islamophobic forces include, folks like Bill Maher, or, there's a group of people called, who identify as new atheists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, who have one of the most virulent anti-Muslim, ideas. They basically say that all religions are bad, but Islam is particularly bad and needs to be wiped out. But also, as you mentioned, the wars and the military industry and imperialism is not just a Republican or party area. I mean, both parties are heavily involved in wars and occupations. And with the Obama administration, he dramatically increased the drone attacks in the Muslim countries, and also the devastating, regime change in Libya. After, we saw the devastating regime change in Iraq, which led to the death of estimated 1.3 million Iraqis. Same, thing was repeated in Libya under Democratic administration, and also counter-violent extremism. You're right. My understanding of starting under Obama administration shows how, that the liberal establishment itself was also involved in surveillance of Muslims and demonizing and dehumanizing Muslims through this program. And there are many other areas. If you look at a particular bill like anti-Sharia laws, that you will see many Democrats also supporting it. And one thing I also want to add, in the wake of the shootings, mass shootings in Parkland and other places, that as you know, gun legislation is very difficult in America. So one thing that both Democrats and Republicans often agree is to throw Muslims under the bus in the guise of gun control. And they have figured out a law which is no fly, no buy, which mostly targets Muslims. Most of the people on no-fly list are Muslim. And in the guise of, gun control, they're further endorsing a policy which is almost totalitarian in its nature. Most people who are on no-fly list are Muslim. Many folks are there without any reason and without any due process to remove themselves or appeal themselves to be removed from no-fly list. In one case, some Muslims refused to become FBI informants, and as a punishment, they were placed on no-fly list. So when Democrats are supporting these kind of policies, they are basically supporting totalitarian practices.
Right. And, it's not that dissimilar from the gang databases, which tend to affect Latinx and African-American men, but, that same thing of a lack of due process, and then an inability of getting off this list, which somebody else in the comments just posted about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also, we mentioned imperialism, we mentioned the war on terror and the government. Of course, we're all reeling from the past week of intense violence against Palestinians in Gaza. And I wonder if you're seeing links or connections between Islamophobia, both US Islamophobia and Israeli Zionist Islamophobia, with what's going on currently.
Definitely, that there's a very clear connection between Israeli occupation and Islamophobia. The act of demonizing or stereotyping Arabs and Muslims as terrorists has a lot to do with Israeli occupation, and how Israeli state has basically, targeted Palestinian, freedom movement as terrorists. That has a huge impact within the U.S. population. There's a movie called Real Bad Arabs, which basically shows the whole growth of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab hysteria through Hollywood movies, but they were mostly, oftentimes support, made in support of the Israeli occupation or normalized Israeli occupation in the U.S. imagination. So that is a really a huge role. But also in general, the Israeli state has played a huge role in the broader U.S. imperialism and wars and occupations abroad, not just in Middle East, but around the world, in Central America, in Africa, in Afghanistan, and these all, and along with Israel, Saudi Arabia, which is support of the Wahhabi school of thought. That has also led to the rise of certain forces that were funded by the United States historically. And what we see that Islamophobia is did not necessarily start, or definitely did not start with 9/11. Their roots were much deeper. But the major, I guess, growth of Islamophobia started with the end of Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, USA needed a new enemy. And Islam became a new enemy at that time to sustain the military-industrial complex. Muslims replaced communists, and Israeli state has played that also, or facilitated that role because it really benefits the Israeli occupation. So yeah, definitely there's a very clear connection in these. And also many pro-Israeli forces are one of the biggest funders of Islamophobia industry in the United States.
And, I found today that the head of the American Jewish Committee just released a letter where he's talking about the people killed in Gaza, and he describes them as being extensions of the Muslim Brotherhood, that they aspire to a caliphate ruled by an interpretation of Islamic law, that they want a Sharia-based jihadist enclave. And this is his justification for Israel's shooting of the protesters this past week. Do you think the Islamophobia is driving the disdain for Palestinians, or do you feel that it's more because there's this need to demonize Palestinians that's driving the Islamophobia?
So, as you mentioned, definitely the Islamophobic forces. Basically, the growth of Islamophobia helps in the Israeli occupation and making that caricature of Muslims as terrorists, even characterizing Hamas, in a very biased way. First of all, my personal understanding is the Palestinian population actually is disillusioned both from Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, but creating that image of that these are that the oppressed people are somehow the oppressors. Is a function of this Islamophobia, this form of anti-Muslim bigotry, so that their occupation could be normalized or justified. So that I totally, in terms of any kind of war, you first have to dehumanize the population, and Islamophobia does that in the case of the Palestinian people.
Right. And we've also seen that major Jewish institutions, unfortunately, like the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee and the JNF also participate in this Islamophobia, and that the AJC, for example, will not work with the Council of American Islamic Relations because it's supposedly an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Definitely. We had experience with ADL because ADL also does, beyond Islamophobia, I would say they are also extension of racism in America. So ADL, of course, in the past spied or probably still spies on Muslims and Palestinians, and also support the police exchange between the United States and Israel, and they were involved locally in Durham to support the police, the exchange, the training between the Durham police and the IDF or Israeli security forces. And we had a movement that basically abolished or ended that kind of cooperation. And the first organization that attacked our coalition was ADL, Anti-Defamation League. And this is the same organization that was recruited earlier by Starbucks to do the anti-racism training. But thanks to the uproar and protest, they had to drop it. So it's very important that we really expose these organizations who are touted as pro-civil rights or anti-racism for their real background in occupation and oppression against Black, Brown, Muslim, and Palestinian people.
Right. And you mentioned earlier, I think, the idea of how Islam is racialized in the United States and how disdain for Muslims and for the religion of Islam is connected to racism. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So the Islam definitely has been racialized, or in other words, Islam and Muslims are not a race. There are many races or ethnic groups within the Muslim population, stretching from Indonesia to West Africa and converts in Europe and the United States. But the oppression of Islamophobia is basically racialized as if they belong to one race, and they have attached certain racial signifiers to Muslims, like covering of the head by women, or a beard, or in a man, or certain opinions on Palestine, to the extent that even people who are perceived as Muslim are targeted by Islamophobia. Actually, one of the biggest targets of homicide-related Islamophobia, not even Muslim, they're Sikh community members who have a beard and a turban and perceived as Muslim, and they have been biggest victims of homicide post 9/11 from folks who had anti-Muslim, opinions or biases. The first person to be killed soon after 9/11 was a Sikh convenience store owner in Arizona. So, and that is a product. That is a form of all forms of racialization, even for African Americans, how they also have been stereotyped and racialized. And there are many ways, of course, the media depiction, how the law enforcement approaches them. But one of the main features that we see in Islamophobia and anti-Black racism, that any act committed by a Muslim is seen as a guilty verdict against the entire Muslim population. Any act committed by a Black person will be taken as a guilty verdict against the entire Black population. But an act committed by a white person will not be taken as a guilty verdict against the entire white population. When Dylan Roof murdered 9 people in South Carolina, that will not lead to surveillance against the entire white population, because that's not the whole purpose of surveillance. The whole purpose of the law enforcement and security and the prison is to enforce white supremacy, is to practice oppression against the marginalized people. And then this is how we can understand how racialization happens and how it is a part and parcel of racism.
Right. Well, it almost seems as though the definition of terrorism is violence by a dark-skinned person.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
There's a great quotation from Linda Sarsour. She says, "We don't expect Buddhists to apologize as Buddhist extremists massacre Muslims in Burma or for their human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. I also don't ask Christians to apologize for the genocide that Bosnian Muslims faced less than 2 decades ago. Nor do I ask every white American to apologize for hate crimes committed by self-proclaimed white Christian supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. All of us instead recognize the religious fanatics perpetrate violent acts for their own deranged reasons. Why is an apology only expected of Muslims?" And I think that really gets to the point you were making about how all Muslims are supposedly responsible for the acts of a few people, whereas that's not seen as the case for other groups.
Definitely. I totally agree.
Yeah. Let's see. So we're at about 7:36. So if people will go on talking, but if people have questions that they want to put in the chat box for Manzoor or me, you can definitely do that now. We just started talking a little bit about what's going on in Israel. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting is there has been this narrative that the conflict in Israel is between Jews and Palestinians, even though Palestinians are not all Muslim, some of them are Christian, but there's sort of this idea that it's a conflict between Jews and Muslims. And yet there is a very evident racism in Israel, even against Jews. If you look at how Ethiopian Jews have been treated, or Yemeni Jews, or the Mizrahi Jews. So I wondered if he had any other thoughts about how this racialization of Muslims plays out in Israel-Palestine.
Definitely, you're absolutely right, and a lot of evidence of this racism against you're right, like dark-skinned Jews, Jewish community, the Black Jews, Mizrahi Jews in Israel, and that also, you know, is a hypocrisy or double standard to Israel being touted as a democracy, or, you know, the only democracy in the Middle East. You know, and also how Muslim and other you know, people are also demonized in a similar way. And I'm not an expert in that. I've not been to Israel, and most of my knowledge is from the media. But I do know that Israel has a direct connection to or role in supporting anti-Black policies within the United States, which is mostly through the police exchanges. The same tear gas fired at Palestinians is, you know, from the same manufacturer that, of course, fired at Black Lives Matter protesters in Ferguson. The same prison, G4S, one of them, that operated in Israel, Palestine, or mostly incarcerating Palestinian, operates in the United States and many other parts of the world. My understanding is they actually abandoned after the protests, you know, and our own city of Durham also played a role. And these are the different ways in which the tools of oppression, tactics of oppression that are developed in Israel are now exported beyond Israel for incarceration and oppression of Black and brown people around the world, that we are very concerned about, and how we can connect. And also the movements like Black Lives Matter have made those connections, and they are understanding, you know, how basically the Israeli occupation is also a part of the larger, you know, oppression of white supremacy.
Right, definitely. And that's the reason that Jewish Voice for Peace has started the Deadly Exchange campaign, which specifically addresses the police exchanges you were talking about. I want to call on, we've got a question from Rosalind. Where does gender fit into your broad and terrific framework that critiques racism, capitalism, and imperialism? Is Rosalind on?
You want me to speak, or you're just?
Sure, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know if we were going to have vocal exchange, but I was just asking Mansour, because I'm thinking you have this strong, broad framework addressing racism, capitalism, and imperialism and their intersections and the racialization of Muslims. But I'm just asking you where gender might fit there, especially given how much, you know, the accusations of misogyny and gender violence are as somehow intrinsic to Islam, that, you know, enters into even these so-called anti-Sharia laws, the fixation on the hijab as a cultural signifier, but also battles over masculinity, who counts as real men. And I think this is actually quite important in the very fascist, racist regime in Israel, which mirrors the one in the United States. You know, by that sort of non-Muslim man as, you know, sort of presenting himself as more a man. And I said the importance of Muslim women as activists and scholars in all these movements.
Okay.
Yes, this is a very good question. And first of all, you know, my purpose here is not to, first of all, whitewash everything that's happening in the Muslim community and broader, you know, Muslim world. Unfortunately, the reality of sexism, you know, inequality, homophobia, these are unfortunate, you know, oppressions within the Muslim population. And this question has been raised to us too, actually in certain Islamophobic ways too, by how can we go and liberate Muslim women? That's what many people ask us locally too, which, if you understand a very imperialistic kind of background, which means as if Muslim women do not have agency to bring the change. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of Muslim women organizers who are fighting against oppression. Linda Sarsour, in our own organization, Sister Shafia, actually half of our organization are Muslim women, Black Muslim women who are organizers on the grassroots, who are fighting oppression, in the community and leading fight on different fronts. And we are also very careful many times, the accusation, as you mentioned, about sexism or let's say homophobia also is used. As I mentioned, there is, first of all, a legitimate areas of oppression in the Muslim population that has to be fought by the Muslims themselves, not through dropping bombs, which is the course that USA takes. For example, when USA went for war in Iraq, one of the justification was given that we are going to liberate Muslim women. Well, number one, people by dropping bombs are women and children who are killed. And the women rights actually in many ways have been reduced in many areas after the war and occupation. And so our role is to identify those forces within the Muslim population who are fighting, Muslim women who are leading the fight, and also challenge what we call it pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is a term by which certain liberal causes are used to further colonize and occupy Muslim people or destroy. For example, saying that Muslims are homophobic and Israeli society is pro-LGBTQ is often used as a way to colonize Palestinian people. But also it is unfair and unjust it doesn't even identify, the LGBTQ forces within the Palestinian population. So we also have to, counter that pinkwashing narrative that often comes, that is used further to colonize the oppressed people.
Well, and the great irony is that at the ceremony moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, the clergy who spoke were both extremely conservative evangelical Christians who tend to be far more homophobic than Muslims. So there's a question from Bina.
I'm unmuted. Yes, thank you. Hi, Mansoor. Thank you so much for this talk. You found me probably smiling and nodding vigorously while I was on mute with so many things that you were saying. And this speaks to me so much as a South Asian Muslim and an Ahmadi Muslim, as somebody who works in this community. And I was really especially touched by what you were saying about the struggles with the non-Black Muslims and talking about critiquing our own community and how we do that with the anti-Black racism within the non-Black Muslim community. And I'm really curious to hear about what the reactions have been with the, when you've approached with your organization, the mainstream Muslim organizations, about how we as non-Black Muslims critique our own communities and our anti-Black racism. Because I struggle with that, where we struggle with this, well, should we quote unquote air our dirty laundry? Sometimes we're accused of dividing our community or weakening, or aiding, Islamophobia in this country if we talk about the anti-Black racism within the South Asian Muslim community, or if I talk about the persecution of Ahmadi Muslims, or any other struggles that we internally have, or if there have been responses about how oftentimes the mainstream Muslim organizations may have a reaction of favoring law enforcement when we have, quote unquote, hate crimes that happen, and how they may not understand that then quickly shows that they don't have that experience of our, Black American Muslims, of that's really not a reaction that many of our Black American Muslim communities would ever really have, is going to law enforcement for help with anything. And being a public defender, of course, that's something I would never really advise, is to calling law enforcement really for anything. So I'm just curious as to what you found have been the best approaches when you go to these mainstream Muslim organizations to talk about how we need to address this, and if you've had positive responses.
Definitely, and thank you so much, Bina. Very important point, and also, a sad reality of persecution of Ahmadi Muslims. Unfortunately, from my home country, Pakistan, has a very ugly role in that, under a so-called liberal government of Bhutto at that time. But so there are so many struggles that we have to engage and fight against. But I absolutely agree that this is very challenging working in the mainstream South Asian or Arab, led organizations. or folks who've been established here to talk about racism. And when I say racism, it's not, as you know well, not like what are their personal opinion about Black people or friendship with Black people. It's about how they have become entrenched in structural racism, how the immigrant Muslim affluent population has been established literally in structural racism, gentrifying neighborhoods, is supporting some of the most racist candidates, being part of the prison industrial complex, or supporting the law enforcement. There are so many examples that I see. The largest mosque here in North Carolina established on land given to freed slaves in 1867. And they're gentrifying the Black neighborhood and have no solidarity with the Black community around them. So this is the biggest challenge we see, that in order to fight Islamophobia, we have to first fight that racism and discrimination within the Muslim. Without that, we cannot even fight against Islamophobia. The way we deal with it is, first of all, and on this particular matter of how Black and brown immigrants have been used as a weapon against Black people, there's a brilliant book called Karma of Brown Folk by Vijay Prashad, talking about the history of 1965 visa policy change that brought a lot of Black and brown immigrants in the United States, who were quickly recruited by right-wing forces as a weapon against Black people. So we, our goal is that we first of all have to build a base and be accountable to a base, even if we are fighting against racism or we are fighting against Islamophobia. And the base that we have identified is Black, brown, impacted Muslims. And they are often, as I mentioned, undocumented, underemployed, unemployed, incarcerated family members, incarcerated, and we work with them. For them, they are already under the radar screen. They are already not even, address their issues by the mosques, the largest mosques. And we work with their issues. We fight on their fronts, and then connect them to the larger anti-racism movement. They work, so in our coalition, we have a Black-led labor union organization, anti-racism organization, voting right organization, who then join also in the fight against Islamophobia. And we try to bring those impacted Muslims into the broader anti-racism movement, because we believe that is essential. We cannot keep people in those silos. The way oppression works is to divide and conquer and divide people into little silos and then attack them one by one. And our purpose is to bring them together, but mostly through the lens of anti-Black racism, because that is our foundational analysis of our organization. And then how through this reality of Islamophobia, we acquaint people to the broader issue of racism.
Excellent. Linda, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting. And this is a question I started with, although I think I probably would ask something different based on everything you're saying, Mansoor. You're terrific. But I'm going to ask this anyway. I was part of a community iftar, like an multi-faith program and dinner that was co-sponsored by CARE and by several different mosques, local mosques in Philadelphia the other night. And at one point, we were asked to please not talk about Israel-Palestine, because it could be too conflictual and it could cause too many problems. And several of the African-American imams had been taken to Israel-Palestine by groups of fairly right-wing Jews and shown how, Israel made the desert bloom. And the representative from CARE said, well, if anyone talks positively in that way about Israel, all of my membership will leave. And that if I actually spoke very critically of Israel, there were others who would leave. And I'm really interested in the way that Israel-Palestine is dealt with over the breadth of the Muslim community, which is fairly wide.
Again, a very important question. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we have seen many examples of what you described, Linda, and about strategically how Zionist forces have been, cultivating relationships with, I would say, pro-Israeli forces with the Muslim population, with the Black Muslim and African-American population, to help in normalizing Israeli occupation, to help in justifying and also create that division. But also that the whole question of Israel-Palestine itself is, as I mentioned, is part of white supremacy. There's a very good book about, I forgot, it's called The Muslims Are Coming, and I will remember the name of the author in a while. And he said that one of the ways Muslims can easily lose their whiteness is when they start talking about Palestine. So if you go to interfaith dinners, if you go to, so the one requirement that is imposed on Muslims is not to talk on Palestine. Why? Because it is going to harm we're going to rupture the harmony in the interfaith dialogue, and the Jewish members are not going to come. And again, our question is the Jewish population a monolithic population? What about Jews who are against Israeli occupation? And that is also a role played by many pro-Israeli forces and the Jewish organizations like ADL, who are also creating in their own way a good Jew, bad Jew kind of categories. And then in our own particular campaign here locally in Durham, when we were successful, they were demonizing Jewish Voice of Peace as not a mainstream Jewish organization. So similarly, within the Muslim population, there is this whole project, which we call a project of good Muslim, bad Muslim. Who's a good Muslim? A good Muslim is, as Bina also mentioned, somebody who works and collaborates with the law enforcement, who basically, in a way, doesn't want to talk about Palestine, who has a good relationship with the pro-Israeli forces, and a bad Muslim who speaks against oppressions, who speaks against imperialism. So it's an imperialist project basically to censor people's voices, suppress people's voices against oppression by creating these kind of criteria. And we also see it we learn it from the Black radical tradition that kind of pressure exists also in the civil rights movement. When Martin Luther King delivered his famous speech in 1967, talking against the triple evil of racism, capitalism, and imperialism, he was attacked by many leaders in NAACP, in SCLC. They were saying that you are getting out of your line. You're not supposed to talk about imperialism. You're not supposed to talk about capitalism. You're supposed to talk only about legal segregation or voting rights. When Paul Robeson was challenging Cold War, he was attacked by the leader of NAACP, Roy Wilkins at that time. And even W.E.B. Du Bois, his passport of citizenship was revoked. So Black radical tradition has always made those unpopular opinions or challenge, they have challenged imperialism. And Muslims, when they are facing the same kind of, censorship on suppression, then we see our struggle as linked to the struggle faced by W.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson or Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Ella Baker or SNCC. All of them made those unpopular, speeches or connections, and they sacrificed. But that's the only way we are going to end this oppression.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mansoor, for drawing those connections. I'm sharing an article about how the American Jewish Committee, both on the one hand, claims to be fostering Jewish-Muslim dialogue, but at the same time, how over the years, they have promoted a lot of notorious anti-Muslim speakers and think tanks, people who've actually been described as anti-Muslim extremists by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so there's this odd phenomenon where you have Jewish groups who on the one hand are claiming that they want to foster more Muslim-Jewish understanding, but they completely refuse to allow any discussion of the political issues. They want to make it all just about theology and about understanding each other's religions, each other's family services, each other's cooking, while they're ignoring what the big issue is.
Thank you so much. This is a very important resource.
Yeah, and I think another thing to pay attention to, there's something called the Muslim Leadership Initiative. I don't know if all of you are familiar with it. It's another Muslim-Jewish dialogue group. It brings young Muslims to Israel to have them experience why Israel is important to Jews. But it's sponsored by the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is a very Zionist organization. And so you have the illusion that this is just a good faith effort to promote understanding, but it's really very clearly an attempt to promote Zionism. And another thing is that it's not just Jewish groups, or it's not just this recruiting of African Americans and Jewish groups, there's also this recruitment of African-American Christian groups. So you're probably familiar with Christians United for Israel, which has one of its great outreach projects going into African-American churches and bringing them to Israel and showing them how great Israel is, and downplaying these very issues of classism and capitalism and anti-Black racism that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and with sad reality, MLI was actually co-founded by one of Muslim chaplains, former chaplain at Duke University. So we have, unfortunately, local reality. And you're right, this whole project also has an impact of basically normalizing Israeli occupation. And they take many Muslims to Israel to show, they call it nuanced version of Zionism, of Israeli occupation. But ironically, most of the people who go are non-Palestinian, so they probably don't even invite Palestinian to that too. But they are Muslim, but from non-Palestinian background. I also agree about how the African American Christian groups are also being recruited by these organizations. And what we say is that we need to out-organize these forces. First of all, the forces like MLI, and I don't want to name that particular guy, but we say, what is their base? Who are they accountable to? They are not accountable to any large Muslim base even. They are, cherry-picked by these organizations to build these MLI kind of institutions. We need to out-organize them. We need to build our own alliances in the social justice movement, with the Black radical tradition, with the Black liberation movement. Locally in North Carolina, we were the North Carolina gave birth to the Modern Monday movement, to HQ on the historic thousand. Let's bring our issues of Islamophobia and Palestine and imperialism in these movements to counteract that. And similarly, I'm with Project South, which is building people's assemblies throughout the South, from Virginia to Texas. And we are working with allies throughout this area, as well as in Global South, in Puerto Rico and Mexico, and how we can bring our analysis and work against Islamophobia, against Israeli occupation, to our social justice allies. That's the only way we will be able to counteract these forces. As I mentioned, we defeated ADL forces, at least locally, in a bill, despite their heavy opposition, through building a very big, broad coalition. And that's the only way we can defeat them.
Right, right. Well, we're at about 7:58. I wondered if anyone else had any questions or any final thoughts to share. So Mansour, going forward, what would be, I mean, you've kind of articulated it, but what would you think would be the most useful steps that we could take to continue to highlight this connection between Islamophobia, but also anti-Black racism, capitalism, imperialism?
Definitely, and I again want to acknowledge and thank Jewish Force of Peace for spearheading the demilitarize from USA to Israel connection, which is a really good example of connecting Israeli occupation to anti-Black racism in the United States. I would just also emphasize that we need to link with the Black radical traditions, the Black liberation movements, who have been the forefront in all of these struggles. The only union that has passed BDS resolution in the United States, the national union, is UE, and it started from UE Local 150, North Carolina, which is a Black-led rank-and-file union that passed BDS resolution. And for the local rank-and-file Black worker, Israeli occupation is not even on the radar screen, but they connect it to the Black radical tradition that has always fought racism at home and anti-colonialism abroad. Or ILW on the West Coast that block Israeli ship. So there are Black radical forces historically who have been at the forefront of fighting against local oppression to global oppressions. And in the US South, where I live, is home to about 55% of the Black population in the country. It has the majority of the low-income people in the country, and also majority of the US military bases, industries. And also Bible Belt, where I'm located, is called Israel Safety Belt because of Christian Zionism. That we really believe working with the local Black population is essential to fight against Israeli occupation, but also by connecting it to the broader struggle against anti-Black racism.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mansour, for just an absolutely wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. It was a great honor to be on
Leslie
this.
Chu and Mansoor, thank you so much. And we look forward to staying connected in so many ways. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.